This guy, I'm so honored to be here with Jeff Booth. He is a visionary leader, lives at the forefront of a whole bunch of technologies, a whole bunch of startups, has been through a whole bunch of financial crises, understands so much about the world in which we are in today, and I want to pick his mind. He wrote a book called The Price of Tomorrow, and not only myself, but many people believe this is the book of the century. So if you don't have it, there'll be a link below, and please follow him on Twitter as well. And he's been published, interviewed by pretty much everybody on Earth. But I'm hoping we can extract a few nuggets from this man's brilliant mind. So, Jeff, how are you today?
Wow, I'm great. Thanks for having me, James. But I hope I live up to your introduction.
Oh, no. Well, I'm very honored to be with you because, first of all, we're kind of aligned in many ways. I do this to give back and help educate people to not only preserve wealth, but also grow it and manage risk. And I think you spend a lot of your time, your mission seems to be helping others wake up to what's going on in the world today. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's fair. It's fair to say. It's when you have everything you need, what do you do? And so as an entrepreneur, typically what an entrepreneur does is try to innovate, to try to create value for other people. And so when I looked at this system level problem that we're talking about, and I was seeing no fixes for a system level problem and not people, I had to do something. So but thank you.
So speaking of your book, so for the audience, I know many people will, hopefully most have read it. Those that haven't, they have to order it, and literally it will change the way you look at the world. But The Price of Tomorrow, could you summarize it for a 10-year-old in 2 to 3 sentences?
Sure. Technology makes everything cheaper. We live in a world that is designed differently and must make prices go up. And so you have two systems colliding against each other. In the existing system that we're in and we measure everything by, we can't see the other system. And so it provides, and if I expand on that a little bit more, so just about every problem in the world that we think is a problem is a derivative of that fight, two systems fighting each other. And you have to ask yourself, is technology going to keep on reducing prices? Is it going to give you more? And what would the corresponding system do to try to stop that?
Yeah, I love that. Related to that, part of what's driving a lot of this is the whole area of exponentiality. And it's really hard to wrap your head around unless you sit and really meditate and think about it. So I know one of your favorite books is Exponential Organizations by Salim Ismail, but understanding exponentiality is not easy. I know people look at, the iPhone generation is getting better and better. But one example that I heard from you in the past was kind of we are in the 34th fold. Kind of everybody out there, if you imagine a napkin or a piece of paper being folded 4 times, it becomes, 1 centimeter thick. But doubling something 29 times beyond that, increases it by a factor of about 540 million. I hope I got some of these numbers right. But can you help people understand this exponentiality and how it relates to money in today's world?
So if we first start on, and remember, 2 different systems that operate exactly diametrically opposed. So in the one system driven by technology, that exponential, that doubling, and if you fold a piece of paper on itself 50 times, it'll reach the sun. But in the early folds, it feels like nothing. It's a couple inches. And when people, and even people who are listening to this, once they hear the parlor trick, they'll think it's a parlor trick, and they'll go check on Google, is that true? And they'll tell their friends, and they will all think, now I understand exponentiality. And they don't, and I don't, because it's hard for our brains to wrap around that type of growth. Yet it's the world we live in. And it's moving at that speed. So if it's moving at that speed and people are looking at artificial intelligence or self-driving cars and everything else, and they're looking backwards against the trend, looking forwards, it's doubling, and it's doubling again. And so if you think about how that connects to an inflationary monetary system, or how the way we work and everything else, we are very likely to miss it. Very likely to, and why most people miss technology. Most people miss the internet. Most people miss the iPhone compared to BlackBerry. Most people miss it is because of the same thing. It's moving on this curve, and they can't project the future at that rate. And so entrepreneurs are typically really good at this and timing this. So you have in one system, you have a system that is giving that massive productivity to the world. Our podcast right now is essentially free to deliver this content to the world. Education is free as a byproduct. There's certification is not free, but and this is coming into every industry as it's driving as a base layer into industry, and it's moving faster and faster and faster. We're exponential, but it's connected to a system that cannot allow that abundance to transfer broadly to us, because if you allow deflation in an inflationary system, then the credit that the system is built on collapses, and you have a deflationary spiral, and what that deflationary spiral would wipe out all credit. So you have this paradox. On one hand, technology should be really good for us, and it should be saving our time everywhere. We should be getting more for less. But the paradox is we're measuring it from a system that requires a system that we live in to grow forever. So that means more jobs, higher pay, and a transfer of wealth from middle class and poor to the rich. And then the transfer keeps going, and that transfer of power to government to make all decisions. That's kind of where we are in the system, caused by 2 systems colliding each other. And while it's easy to look at a system level problem and blame people like the Fed or anybody else in the system, if you yourself if you didn't hold Apple from the beginning to where it is now, or Amazon from $5 to where it is now, or you're making the same mistake, and you didn't hold those because you misunderstood what's happening with technology underneath. If you misunderstood, it's easy. We think we can, and everybody else can't. So why would it be any different for a central banker? Why would it be any different for anybody in an existing system that grew up an entire system and is measuring that system to misunderstand what's happening with technology? It's normal.
Yeah, you've brought me down a different path that I was going to take this, but it's always such a way you say so many profound things that are really hard to wrap your head around, but they trigger more questions. So let's double click into that whole deflation story. So technology drives deflation, things get better, cheaper, faster, etc. Investing, whether it's money printing or people investing, whatever, chasing fewer goods, drives inflation. Now, Cathie Wood invests in disruption, and she's a big believer in deflation, but it's not happening at the rate she thought it would. So can you help us figure out this conundrum? And if you look at like her tech stock choices, they've gotten hammered this year so far because she placed the bet on deflation and deflationary forces. And I don't know if she's admitted it yet, but she hasn't seen the level of inflation that we actually have and live through today, which I see continuing. Like her and I agree on everything except for this one point.
This is, by the way, this is actually the problem that people get caught in, and they're measuring a time period that is too short. Yeah. And so just ask yourself to simplify that question. To simplify that question, what would happen today if all governments around the world stopped easing?
Yeah, the GDP would tank immediately. Growth of GDP would tank,
and all credit would collapse.
Yep.
And you would have a deflationary spiral that would be picking up speed, and it would accelerate until the kind of the laws of nature fell to the actual pace to where what's actually happening today. So you have these two systems working against each other. One requires more and more stimulus on a greater curve, offsetting what's happening to deflationary pressure underneath. But we don't see it because we're measuring from the system that's offsetting that deflation. So you have to ask yourself, remove the artificial stimulus, and what would the world look like? So that's what Cathie is saying. Now, double click on that. If you keep on artificially stimulating QE, you're actually robbing productivity from the market because you're transferring to government, and government has to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're removing the free market. And it's subpar so there's less and less industry that can move. Also, because prices are being pushed up naturally, businesses must, even in the short term, you don't see it even because supply chains get havoc and everything else, but businesses must, to compete, remove labor faster. So you have these two systems moving further and further apart. And what Cathie is missing is, and so the more you try to drive that inflationary environment, the more you're actually feeding the deflationary one. And now the question is timing. The question is, so today prices went up in the stock market. Why did they go up in the stock market? Is because China's easing to be able to save Evergrande and everything else that would be the cascading collapse. And wherever the easing is in the world, it has to find itself back into the monetary system, no matter where. And so what's happening as a result of that, no matter where it is, we're measuring the system from the system. And you just to be able to clear that in your mind, what would happen? What would the market look like without manipulation?
Exactly. So
deflation. And so what Cathie is essentially wrong or mistiming on is when this pushes up so high that it moves into a deflationary environment anyways, or the only way to save the inflationary environment is to capture all control in government and keep going.
So again, you brought another question. So imagine if there was a deflationary world, would there be any incentive for people to spend? Because in a true deflationary world, what drives the economy if cash savings grow and purchasing power is free forever? Another conundrum.
So I love that question because it starts to double click. Again, our brains don't hang on to concepts that we haven't seen before. It's new, it's novel, and what I'm saying is going to be really hard to hang on to because you don't have a pattern developed in the world that hasn't reinforced on that pattern. It's like you hear every conversation in a room, even if you're just talking to me. But if somebody else says your name, you'll tune into their conversation. What this conversation is like is all the other conversations in the room until you've heard it enough times. Because so from that, will people purchase? Now, ask yourself that question. Would you purchase a new iPhone, even though that there's going to be a better one the next year? Of course you would. Would you purchase food if you know that there could be more food next year? Of course you would. Would you purchase a TV? Would you purchase just a whole bunch of things? Purchasing might go down, but it might go down because we'll buy the things we need more. But to believe that inflation is required for purchasing is essentially this. If you double click on that, the only reason I purchase is because somebody's stealing my money. It's insane. Productivity in the world, productive economy doesn't require theft. And so if you steal my money faster, I'll purchase more. That may be true today in the world we live in, from the system we live in today, because people, but even that is becoming less and less true because the purchasing isn't going into things, it's going into assets that are destroying a productive economy to be able to capture, essentially save more purchasing power for later through assets.
Unbelievable. So let's, related to that, if you take the mathematical certainty. I've heard you saying these terms before. And when I look at the scenario of money printing, talk about the Fed or central banks all over the world or China easing, there is that GDP tipping point. You probably heard about it before. I think it was from the World Bank, the 77% magic number. Basically, if an economy borrows more than 77% of GDP, they can't escape. There's no longer any escape philosophy to get out of that, because the servicing of that debt will eat away at the GDP. So what do you think about that? And is the only way, I think I know the answer to the question, is to keep on money printing and to keep the cost of debt servicing down, which means we live in a stage of perpetual low interest rates going forward from here with quantitative easing that's managed some way or another?
Again, this is why these are hard to see, is because people don't think in systems. They think in individual parts of a system, and it's hard to see the whole system. So if you think about, let's go through the options today. So the options from central banking from the system globally. Door one, let the free market work. That would have a deflationary depression. And it wouldn't be the deflation I'm talking about in the book, where productivity is broadly transferred to society. It would be a debt deflation, like the Great Depression on steroids. But because the entire system is built on that debt, every bank would fail. There would be no food on shelves. And into that vacuum would rise dictators.
And that's the 280 over 70, the 280 trillion of debt servicing the global 70 trillion of GDP.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you let that system, because it's based on credit, if you allow deflation, the credit explodes in value, it explodes in credit, and you can never reservice that credit. So it gets wiped out. You have a credit crisis, but the system is credit. It keeps on unwinding. So people that think they have money in the bank, that's actually a credit instrument. The bank's closed, and it keeps on unwinding. So door number one, unfortunately, but that's where we are. Door number two is ease forever. But easing forever by lowering interest rates, pretending I'm going to raise them one day, but having to lower them again, even what's happening today, right? The head fakes on raising them, but having to lower them perpetually forever, because the credit must grow forever to protect an inflationary environment, which is exactly against the kind of where technology is going. By doing that, you transfer a whole bunch of wealth from the middle class and poor to the rich. And because there's way more middle class and poor number of people, they rise up against the rich, or elect other people to be able to say it's the rich's fault to be able to do this. And you have a turning of society because the many outweigh the few. And what ends up happening is you change leaders in a system that must still manipulate money to protect the system, to make it worse. But they create a whole bunch of essentially us versus them through that system, which resets typically, if you look at the long arc of history, through revolution and war. Essentially, I need to get elected by turning one part of my population, the bigger part of my population, against the smaller part of my population. And then to stay elected, I need to create a bigger enemy outside my gates. And so that's what these resets look like throughout kind of the long arc of history. But the problem is we've never had that type of reset, with the weapons of destruction and where technology is going today. So, and that global conflict that would arise from that type of is a pretty scary thing to think of. And worse, we don't see it coming. I've said this often on a couple other podcasts, but it's really important. When you think about Hitler rising into power because of the same hyperinflationary environment that was created, and who he turned the population against, you can see kind of what happens throughout this cycle. But worse than that is we all believe our minds don't change, and we're perfect. We understand the truth perfectly, but nobody else does. What ends up happening through that manipulation is people are turned against other people. And if you ask yourself, forget about Hitler, how did an entire population not stand up and do something about that when you created atrocities to other people? And then they either helped or stayed silent. And that is unfortunately human nature in a system that requires manipulation. We get manipulated. And so some of these things have really profound implications for where the world's going, because when you have corruption and money, as a result of having corruption and money, you must have corruption everywhere in society. So those are door number one, door number two. And so what you have today is you have governments trying to run financial repression and inflate, so your real dollars are going down in value. And they're trying to hold you into a system to run that financial repression. I think in the 40s, it worked for the U.S., but the U.S. was a superpower at that time, and there wasn't another challenger. Today, when that's happening with China on the bank and everything else, and the type of global conflicts that are going to rise from that, it's not possible. Plus, you have Bitcoin that is an escape valve from that financial repression. So it's really hard to lock people into a currency. Why people don't see it is because they measure everything in the currency they're denominated in.
Exactly.
They buy more houses, they buy more everything else, and some people are getting so rich by that experiment. I leverage up, I buy more assets. They don't see the next wave of this when revolution comes to take that asset back, or politicians take it back and redistribute it.
Or they have no comprehension of a 15% hurdle rate, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. So they think they're getting richer, when in fact they're getting poorer and creating the divide of society. And a lot of those people think it's because of their brilliance that they're getting richer in real estate. And as rents are going up and you're pushing pain on more of society, And then those people in society go and elect people that say, I got an idea. Let's do UBI. Right? And I'm going to push up prices higher and transfer more wealth, because where does the money come from in the first place? And so I'm going to pick your pocket more to give you a working wage to push prices up higher. So that's where we are in this system. And so there's only really those two doors. Except say we can go into Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is the first time in history that we've had a third door.
So speaking of door number one and door number two, so when they talk about threatening tapering or raising interest rates, they're just playing with our heads, or will they reduce by 12.5% for a couple of months and then wait for an external event and then increase quantitative easing again?
Yeah. So again, when we get to these things and in all of this, the simplest thing to say, if you just don't, is all of this creates more instability in the system and more instability in us because we're in that system. As we look around to try to figure out what's going on, your podcast is probably so valuable because you interview people on this, and people are looking for what's going on, and it's creating more and more instability. And people are, you've probably seen me say this: which snowflake causes the avalanche? And people are trying to measure which snowflake, and they're grasping at this and this, and they're all over the place. The simplest thing to say is the system demands more easing. That will create more instability in a system, and I don't know at what time brings the whole thing down. It could be anything. There's more and more snowflakes gathering all the time.
So you touched on UBI. I didn't expect to go down the UBI path, but do you believe it's a foregone conclusion?
I think if you just simply say there's more of them, more people being left out than today that are in the have-nots outnumber the haves, and the Fed will be merged with Treasury over time as rules change, because the many will elect people that will create a populist movement. That's highly likely all over the world.
And I noticed a very funny stat just yesterday that the percentage of GDP of external debt, total debt of USA and Canada is exactly the same percentage. Did you ever notice that? 141%?
I didn't notice that, no.
It's 141%. Is it rigged? Or Canada and the US in cahoots right now?
If you think about it, Canada is a raw materials base. Most of the exports are raw materials. And you print money, then raw materials go up in relation.
Yeah, it's like I ran a scenario. I looked at some treasury numbers. I looked at the increase of household wealth, but since basically January 2020 and today, that's where we're stuck. So let's
because if you think about that too, and so inflation, the other side of the coin for inflation is wage deflation.
Yeah.
Right. So so if you have savings or you're working for wages, your real income is going down, and so no wonder, and the more assets you have, the more of the transfer.
Exactly. You touched on China as well, and China, as you know, has more US T-bills, Treasury bills, than the US balance sheet. So, and China has started selling T-bills to other nations. Is there a concern China will become the dominant currency, especially with the digital yuan coming forward? What do you envision?
So I think it was in 2016, China realized that the US wasn't going to pay back their loans. Essentially, vendor financing and it was a decent trade. The US to keep interest rates low, China bought US currency bonds. Because if interest rates went up at the time, then the U.S. would have collapsed, and China would have subsequently collapsed too. Purchasing nation, exporting nation, and so. But about 2016, I think maybe 2015, China stopped buying the T-bills and said, "Wait, this is going to happen. Why don't we buy assets instead? Rare earth mines, all of the critical assets for the infrastructure build to the other side. Where do we get political gain, Belt and Road, and everything else? Where do we take this money and put it somewhere else so it can't be destroyed in value, but more so we have more control over the next phase of where this is going?" Which, when I said creates tensions, war machine, everything else, because that's effectively what it does. And so essentially, U.S. doing that faster, printing more money faster, drives this divide faster and faster and faster. Now, I do not believe that the world is going to switch to replace the U.S. currency with a digital one. But I do believe certain people will, and that'll create these major polarized states that turn into world war.
Exactly. That's so funny. I did this in a video probably 2 or 3 months ago. I talked about World War III could be potentially, I don't want to alarm anybody out there, but could be potentially triggered by kind of a quasi-currency war. Those that force certain nation states around the world to use and embrace certain currencies will drive that war. For example, the activities of China and Africa right now, building railroads and mines, etc. They're clearly, the continent of Africa will be forced to go down the digital yuan route, and then the U.S. Reserve currency. But then there'll be a third currency. I hate to use the term currency for Bitcoin, but that will be Bitcoin. So there'll be U.S. dollar, yuan, and Bitcoin, and those three will fight out amongst themselves. Do you envision such a weird future?
Yeah, I do. To facilitate global trade, you have to have a measuring unit that isn't all over the map. Or that is being manipulated. But today we have measuring units as being manipulated everywhere. Or here's, if you look back through the long arc of history, people say that a currency failure happens every, call it 80 years or 80 to 100 years today. And it used to happen over a much longer time period. 2,000 years ago, it took a lot longer. And why might that be? And I have a thesis on this, and it's the same thesis that's in my book. Technology has always been moving. It's always been a force for deflation, but it happened very slowly throughout time, and it's speeding up faster and faster. So the great turning that people talk about every 80 years, it's not necessarily every 80 years. It happens as a result of our personal need to believe we can get something, we can get more than we can actually get. So we'll vote people in. If somebody said, listen, I only have this much money to be able to pay for this services, we would never vote that person in. We'll vote for somebody in that will lie to us, hide that lie to inflation, and build a system on inflation on top of that the lie must get bigger and bigger, tied greater expanding services that do everything what we're talking, and then it gets into a long debt cycle that has to reset. So if you look at through the historic lens, I think that's actually what's happening. Technology has been moving faster and faster all the time, even going back to Roman days, right? And technology has been moving faster and faster. So you get these events, you get these clearing things, and now you wind that back to 1971, the U.S. dollar probably would have failed in 1971 had they not tied energy to oil, to U.S. dollar to oil, which was energy. And because of the war machine to be able to Saudi Arabia and the PAC, if you were outside of that oil for US dollar system, you were cut off from trade for the world. Look at what it looks like in Venezuela. Look at what it looks like in any country who's tried to get off that system. Look what happened in Iraq when Iraq talked about pricing oil in Europe. And so when you think about that system today, it extended US dollar dominance for another, call it 50 years.